This is a CBS News Special Report. I'm Norah O'Donnell in the nation's capital. President Biden will address the nation any moment about the rising tensions on Ukraine's border. The White House says the president will provide an update on Russia's latest moves and will reiterate that the United States remains open to high-level diplomacy in close coordination with our allies. Today, Russia announced it's pulling back some of the troops from the border with Ukraine, but the U.S. and its allies is waiting to see if that is actually happening. Now, earlier today, a big development, the websites of Ukraine's defense ministry and armed forces, along with two state banks, were hit by cyber attacks. We do not know who orchestrated these attacks. Senior White House correspondent Weijia Jiang joins us now. And Weijia, tell us what's been happening at the White House today.
Nora, President Biden has been receiving briefings, and we certainly expect him to address those cyber attacks because for weeks now, our sources here have said that they believe that cyber attacks would come before any military invasion. And now this is the second major one on Ukrainian systems that we have seen. Ukraine has already responded to say that they did, in fact, confirm that there were several services disabled on Ukrainian websites, as well as major banks. However, the U.S. has not responded. We also expect the president to give an update about the flurry of phone calls he has had with foreign leaders, including France's Emmanuel Macron this morning. We know that he spoke with Russia's Vladimir Putin over the weekend, and that did not yield any breakthrough. Nora?
All right, we're looking at now live pictures of the president's aide putting his remarks on the podium there. Let's bring in Charlie D'Agata, who is in Ukraine for us. And Charlie, what's been the reaction there about this Russian announcement that they're supposedly drawing some forces back?
Well, Nora, they're not buying it. The foreign ministry said we'll believe it when we see it, and we'll only believe in a proper de-escalation when we see a full pullout or a significant pullout of Russian troops, not what they have been seeing. And of course, they're sharing intelligence with the United States, but they can see what's happening, especially along the border with Belarus. And that's what's really causing concern. There have been Russian forces along the eastern border. In fact, they've been fighting along that eastern border for a number of years, since 2014. But it's these military exercises that are happening in Belarus that's really got people spooked. You got around 30,000 Russian troops in joint military exercises with Belarus. It's only 200 or 300 miles from the capital, Kyiv. And that is what's got people spooked. Having said that, it's extraordinary. People are just going about their lives. I mean, I think they know or fear that an attack may be imminent. They just don't know what the size and scale of it's going to be. Nora?
All right, Charlie D'Agata, thank you. Here now, the President of the United States.
Today, I'd like to provide an update on the crisis involving Russia and Ukraine. From the beginning of this crisis, I have been absolutely clear and consistent. The United States is prepared no matter what happens. We are ready with diplomacy to be engaged in diplomacy with Russia and our allies and partners to improve stability and security in Europe as a whole. And we are ready to respond decisively to Russian attack on Ukraine, which is still very much a possibility. For all the events of the last few weeks and months, this has been our approach, and it remains our approach now. So today I want to speak to the American people about the situation on the ground, the steps we've taken, the actions we're prepared to take, and what's at stake for us and the world, and how this may impact on us here at home. For weeks now, together with our allies and partners, my administration has engaged in non-stop diplomacy. This weekend, I spoke again with President Putin to make clear that we are ready to keep pursuing high-level diplomacy, to reach written understandings among Russia, the United States, and the nations of Europe to address legitimate security concerns, if that's his wish. Their security concerns and ours. President Putin and I agreed that our team should continue to engage toward this end, along with our European allies and partners. Yesterday, the Russian government publicly proposed to continue the diplomacy. I agree. We should give the diplomacy every chance to succeed. And I believe there are real ways to address our respective security concerns. The United States has put on the table concrete ideas to establish a security environment in Europe. We're proposing new arms control measures, new transparency measures, new strategic stability measures, These measures would apply to all parties, NATO and Russia alike. And we're willing to make practical, result-oriented steps that can advance our common security. We will not sacrifice basic principles, though. Nations have a right to sovereignty and territorial integrity. They have the freedom to set their own course and choose with whom they will associate. But that still leaves plenty of room for diplomacy and for de-escalation. That's the best way forward for all parties, in our view. We'll continue our diplomatic efforts in close consultation with our allies and our partners. As long as there is hope of diplomatic resolution that prevents the use of force and avoids incredible human suffering that would follow, we will pursue it. The Russian defense minister reported today that some military units are leaving their positions near Ukraine. That would be good, but we have not yet verified that. We have not yet verified the Russian military units are returning to their home bases. Indeed, our analysts indicate that they remain very much in a threatening position. And the fact remains, right now, Russia has more than 150,000 troops encircling Ukraine and Belarus and along Ukraine's border. An invasion remains distinctly possible. That's why I've asked several times that all Americans in Ukraine leave now before it's too late to leave safely. It is why we have temporarily relocated our embassy from Kyiv to Lviv in western Ukraine, approaching the Polish border. And we've been transparent with the American people and with the world about Russia's plans and the seriousness of the situation so that everyone can see for themselves what is happening. We've shared what we know and what we're doing about it. Let me be equally clear about what we are not doing. The United States and NATO are not a threat to Russia. Ukraine is not threatening Russia. Neither the U.S. nor NATO have missiles in Ukraine. We do not have plans to put them there as well. We're not targeting the people of Russia. We do not seek to destabilize Russia. To the citizens of Russia, you are not our enemy. And I do not believe you want a bloody, destructive war against Ukraine, a country and a people with whom you share such deep ties of family, history, and culture. 77 years ago, our people fought and sacrificed side by side to end the worst war in history. World War II was a war of necessity. But if Russia attacks Ukraine, it would be a war of choice, or a war without cause or reason. I say these things not to provoke, but to speak the truth, because the truth matters. Accountability matters. If Russia does invade in the days and weeks ahead, the human cost for Ukraine will be immense. And the strategic cost for Russia will also be immense. If Russia attacks Ukraine, it'll be met with overwhelming international condemnation. The world will not forget that Russia chose needless death and destruction. Invading Ukraine will prove to be a self-inflicted wound. The United States and our allies and partners will respond decisively. The West is united and galvanized. Today, our NATO allies and the alliance is as unified and determined as it has ever been. And the source of our unbreakable strength continues to be the power, resilience, and universal appeal of our shared democratic values. Because this is about more than just Russia and Ukraine. It's about standing for what we believe in, for the future we want for our world, for liberty, the right of countless countries to choose their own destiny, and the right of people to determine their own futures, for the principle that a country can't change its neighbors' borders by force. That's our vision. And toward that end, I'm confident that vision, that freedom will prevail. If Russia proceeds, we will rally the world to oppose its aggression. The United States and our allies and partners around the world are ready to impose powerful sanctions on export controls, including actions that we did not pursue when Russia invaded Crimea in eastern Ukraine in 2014. We will put intense pressure on their largest and most significant financial institutions and key industries. These measures are ready to go as soon and if Russia moves. We'll impose long-term consequences that will undermine Russia's ability to compete economically and strategically. And when it comes to Nord Stream 2, the pipeline that would bring natural gas from Russia to Germany, if Russia further invades Ukraine, it will not happen. While I will not send American servicemen to fight in Ukraine, we have supplied the Ukrainian military with equipment to help them defend themselves. We provided training and advice and intelligence for the same purpose. And make no mistake, the United States will defend every inch of NATO territory with the full force of American power. An attack against one NATO country is an attack against all of us. And the United States' commitment to Article 5 is sacrosanct. Already, in response to Russia's buildup of troops, I've sent additional U.S. forces to bolster NATO's eastern flank. Several of our allies have also announced they'll add forces and capabilities to ensure deterrence and defense along NATO's eastern flank. We will also continue to conduct military exercises with our allies and partners to enhance defensive readiness. And if Russia invades, we'll take further steps to reinforce our presence in NATO, reassure us for our allies, and deter further aggression. To be clear, if Russia decides to invade, that would also have consequences here at home. But the American people understand that defending democracy and liberty is never without cost. This is a cause that unites Republicans and Democrats. And I want to thank the leaders and members of Congress of both parties who've forcefully spoken out in defense of our most basic, most bipartisan, most American principles. I will not pretend this will be painless. There could be impact on our energy prices. So we are taking active steps to alleviate the pressure on our own energy markets and offset raising prices. We're coordinating with major energy consumers and producers. We're prepared to deploy all the tools and authority at our disposal to provide relief at the gas pump. And I'll work with Congress on additional measures to help protect consumers and address the impact of prices at the pump. We are not seeking direct confrontation with Russia, though I've been clear that if Russia targets Americans in Ukraine, we will respond forcefully. And if Russia attacks the United States or our allies through asymmetric means, like disruptive cyber attacks against our companies or critical infrastructure, we are prepared to respond. But we're moving in lockstep with our NATO allies and partners to deepen our collective defense against threats in cyberspace. Two paths are still open. For the sake of historic responsibility, Russia and the United States share for global stability, for the sake of our common future, to choose diplomacy. But let there be no doubt, if Russia commits this breach by invading Ukraine, responsible nations around the world will not hesitate to respond. We do not stand for freedom where it is at risk today. We'll surely pay a steeper price tomorrow. Thank you. I'll keep you informed.
Well, there you have the President of the United States saying we should give diplomacy every chance to succeed. Also responding to the statement today from the Russian's defense minister suggesting that some of their units may be leaving. President Biden saying, well, that would be good, but, quote, we have not verified that. In fact, our analysts show that those Russian forces still remain in a, quote, threatening position. Let's bring our national security correspondent, David Martin. He is at the Pentagon. David, a couple different things interested me in what the president said. He had a new number for the amount of Russian troops that have encircled Ukraine, 150,000. Tell us what you're learning today.
Well, not only is the U.S. not seeing any evidence that Russia is pulling troops back from the Ukrainian front, they are seeing evidence of exactly the opposite. They are seeing Russian units move out of those assembly areas where they've been parked for weeks, and we've all seen them in the commercial satellite photos, bumper to bumper. And now they are coming out of those assembly areas, moving toward the border and dispersing into the field. And when they get into the field, they are putting up camouflage netting so that they are not so easily observed from space. So no matter what President Putin and what the Russian Defense Ministry is saying, what the U.S. is seeing on the ground is the Russian army uncoiling in preparation for an invasion of Ukraine.
David, what do military analysts that you speak with think that Putin will do, that he will move to seize the capital of Ukraine first, and then what?
Well, of course, this is the big guessing game, how far he is willing to go, because what he's done is given himself the option to do almost anything, including a full invasion, which would begin with probably cyber attacks, airstrikes, electronic warfare against the leadership of Ukraine in the capital of Kyiv. And we've already seen today some cyber attacks on the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense websites and the websites of a couple of state-owned banks. There's no attribution to those attacks yet, but obviously one suspect would be Russia. But Russia has the capability to do much, much more than just take some websites offline. They have the capability to basically black out all digital communications in the capital of Ukraine.
And is the thought that if Russia were to seize Ukraine's capital of Kyiv, that the rest of the country would then capitulate?
Well, I think that's one question that Putin is probably asking himself. He's like any leader. He wants maximum benefit at minimum cost. And if he can get rid of that government in Kyiv and install a pro-Russian government that might, say, invite Russian troops in, then I'm sure that would be great with him. But he has done the planning and amassed the forces for an invasion that actually could go beyond Ukraine. There is intelligence that they might go from Ukraine into the country of Moldova, which is on Ukraine's southern border. There are already tens of thousands of troops in Belarus, which is on Russia's northern border, Ukraine's northern border. So if Putin goes all out, he could seize control, really, of three countries, Ukraine, Moldova, and Belarus, and bring them back into the Russian sphere of influence and basically take back a good chunk of the Russian Empire that was lost at the end of the Cold War.
And I want to put an exclamation point on what you just said, David, because I think that's something new, at least that I'm learning today from our collective reporting here at CBS News, that Putin's ambitions may extend beyond Ukraine, or his immediate ambitions, I should say, and why he has amassed such a huge force of 150,000 Russian troops, that the idea that he could move towards Moldova and Belarus, as you mentioned, of course, the State Department warning all U.S. citizens to leave Moldova just last night. Where would that put him geographically if he were able to move that aggressively on those countries?
Well, it would put Russian troops right on the front lines with Poland. If you look at a map, it just moves his frontier westward, further and closer toward NATO's eastern flank. And of course, that's why the U.S. and NATO have been talking about activating this response force, which would involve 20,000, maybe more troops to reinforce all those countries like Poland who would now be on the front lines with Russia.
I'm going to bring in Charlie D'Agata, who's in Ukraine, in just a moment. But just on that point that you just made, the effort by the United States and others to harden NATO's eastern flank, the deployment of 5,000 U.S. troops, plus the movement of existing Stryker brigades in Germany to NATO's eastern edge. And then, David, I understand that the Secretary of Defense, Secretary Austin, will be in Poland later this week.
That's right. He landed this afternoon in Brussels, the headquarters of NATO, for a meeting of the NATO defense ministers in which you can be sure they will discuss exactly what the plans will be for reinforcing Europe if Russia invades. And then he is going to see these additional troops which have deployed into Poland. But we should point out that those troops, they come from the 82nd Airborne, and they're some of our best soldiers, but those are light infantry troops. They are not troops that you would send to stop a Russian armored brigade. And one of the reasons they are there is simply to help process Americans who have to flee Ukraine. They would set up along the border with Ukraine, open processing stations to just receive Americans and get them on their way back to some other life. So far, they've set up only one receiving station because up until now, the flow of Americans fleeing Ukraine, at least across the land border, has been relatively small.
David Martin at the Pentagon standby. Want to bring in Charlie D'Agata, who is in Lviv, Ukraine, which is near the border with Poland. And Charlie, if Russia were to invade, the estimates are talking about a massive migration of people out of Ukraine, perhaps into Poland, tens of thousands of people. They would largely move through an area near where you are. Describe what you're learning.
Well, you know, Nora, that David Martin paints a pretty dark picture, and I think the mood on the streets in Kyiv is one of, they're hoping that it's just not going to happen. There hasn't been any sort of panic buying. There hasn't been any mass exodus. There hasn't been any fleeing from an area that might come under attack, certainly from the capital itself. Now, here in Lviv, it's about a 7.5, 8-hour drive due west of Kyiv. We're about another hour and 15 minutes from the Polish border. People here are just acting as life goes on. Life is normal. There hasn't been a huge influx of people here. In fact, there hasn't been an influx at all. We've been talking to the people on the street. Have you seen more traffic, more people coming here? We have, however, spoken to a few Americans who have come here. This is where the embassy has now rebased itself. It's thought to be safer. It's thought to be a place because of its proximity to the Russian border and the fact that it is further away from Kyiv, certainly further away from Belarus, any of those areas that might become potential battlegrounds. It's thought to be a safer place for anybody who may be either wanting to come here in order to avoid any of the conflicts, or it gives them the opportunity to cross over into Poland, if that's the case, certainly for Americans. We don't know how many Americans are still here. As far as we know, the airspace is still open. A number of Americans have been able to get out on commercial flights. They know that they've been urged by the State Department and others that now is the time to leave while they still can leave. But in terms of a mass influx, it just hasn't happened. We've been speaking to authorities on the Polish border. They said about 100 Americans have crossed, not much more than that. So, you know, look, everybody here is living day to day, and now hour to hour. They know about this, you know, February 16th date that everybody's been talking about. The government has sort of been downplaying that. They don't want to sow panic on the streets. Largely, they're just getting on with their lives. But yes, if this thing turns, you know, dramatically dangerous, we're going to see an influx of thousands, tens of thousands of people trying to get through here.
Charlie D'Agata in Lviv, Ukraine. Thank you, Charlie. Let's bring in our senior White House correspondent, Weijia Jiang. And Weijia, I want to ask you about, I understand that the White House has assembled what they're calling a Tiger team to talk about possible responses to all scenarios. What are you learning?
That's right, Norah. So even though diplomacy has always been the preferred path from the very beginning, even today, as the president reiterated, CBS News has learned just how clear-eyed the administration has been about the possibility of an invasion. And in fact, the National Security Council put together that Tiger Team effort back in November to begin putting the pieces together in the case of an invasion. There have been several tabletop exercises, planning efforts. There is a playbook that goes through step by step what would need to happen among the various agencies in play here if Russia were to invade. That includes the Defense Department, the State Department, the Department of Energy, Treasury, and of course the intelligence community to get right into action and offer primarily humanitarian assistance and to help Ukraine move forward. But something that the president made very clear today, Norah, was that U.S. servicemen were not going to be fighting in Ukraine. He reiterated that point. He promised that the U.S. would maintain its commitments, its NATO commitments, but said that the troops would not be fighting on the ground. Norah?
Yeah, an incredibly important point, and one area where Republicans and Democrats are united about America's engagement. Weijia Jiang from inside the White House press briefing room, thank you. One other note, the president saying that if Russia decides to invade, there will be consequences and that there could be an impact on our energy prices. We're going to have more on that impact tonight on the CBS Evening News. For now, our coverage will continue on our CBS News streaming, your local news. And again, as I said, we'll have all the wrap up tonight on the CBS Evening News. This has been a CBS News Special Report. I'm Norah O'Donnell in Washington.
For news 24 hours a day, go to CBSNews.com.